of rock and roll, Mr. Elvis Presley, screaming into the vertiginous void of his own inchoate soul set to ambient techno accompaniment. Welcome back. I'm Layman Pascal, and you're listening to episode 3 of The Soul of AI on Integral Stage After Dark. Folks, we stand at a potentially radical historical moment. It's potential because we face conflicting hunches about how far these new electronic pseudo-intelligences can actually go, and it's radical because many people feel we've already entered a sci-fi territory where artificial general intelligence, whether or not it has any real subjectivity, could be the determining factor for the future of our species. But regardless of those big picture outcomes, the tools that we already have in play, which are continuing to be modified and merged with other domains in technology, already have the ability to cause an imminent disruption to almost all human control systems and to the already pretty dubious psychology of the general population. So if our goal is to maximize the mutual enhancement of living and non-living intelligence systems towards something like depth and the distribution of wisdom, well-being, and empathic rationality, how do we need to think about the situation? Which warnings and which visions should be heeded? How do we skew these tools toward wisdom? And how do we deal with the poorly incentivized human organizations likely to misuse them deliberately or accidentally? What are the limitations in how we're thinking and which voices need to be amplified in this space? Joining me to help me feel into all of this today is legendary Irish folk hero and trans-Pacific developmental theorist Fionn Wright, who has just authored a paper on what he calls the universeifier, described as an AI-supported full-spectrum developmental ecosystem to evolve regenerative metamodern structures. Hi, Fionn.
Woo! Good to be on the radio.
So I want to dive into the universeifier, but as I mentioned to you beforehand, I thought I would invite you to be a deeper participant in the series by helping it to process itself. So I propose to tell you what I've taken away from the first 2 interviews and see how that lands with you. The first conversation I had was with Zen Master Soryu, and I would say that his vision is somewhat bleak. It's that each increase in human technological capacity has led to an increase in unnatural deaths in the murdering of sentient beings, and that this isn't anyone's particular goal, but it's the observable trend of the historical outcomes of people quasi-religiously embedded in the dominant worldviews associated with the new technology of any era. And we should expect the same danger to be amplified by the current period of technological emergence, defined by what he calls cyborgregores, human collectives interlinked and amplified by generative, massively informed machine intelligences. So the emerging ecosystem of tools will most likely involve massive suffering to sentient beings, unless or until it is skewed toward wisdom, which in turn requires wisdom-oriented AIs, or what he calls AWs. And so we must focus very resolutely on producing wisdom-aligned, cybernetically amplified collective entities. How does that sound to you?
Wow. First of all, I love it. I haven't heard of his work before. And so the first part was a little bit, you know me, I skew a little bit towards the light rather than the dark when we can. But I heard the light in the last part of what you said. So, framing technology in that way, increasing deaths or kind of just seeing it kind of with a negative overlay in how it has been in human experience so far is a perspective to take. And there's certainly some truth to it. And I think we could take a very other completely opposite pole end of the spectrum perspective, and it would be equally valid. It's brought a lot of beauty into the world. It's brought a lot of thriving, healthy functionality into the world. In addition to all of the other destructive, harmful ways that it shows up. And so I don't know if that first part of the argument makes a place for the second part of the argument, but I certainly agree with the concept of wisdom-imbued AI. That's the directionality that my work goes as well. I don't necessarily use the word wisdom, but it's in the same vein. And essentially, we'll get to my work a bit later, but looking at AI, there's a lot of talk about, whether it's AGI, artificial general intelligence, or whether it's actually conscious or not, or what is that point, and we've kind of passed the Turing method now at some point. So it's like, we don't even really know. And these large language models are now seemingly out of control in so many ways that we don't actually know what's happening in the depths of, how they're being developed and how they're evolving over time. So in that way, there is the challenge of uncertainty. And I would lean towards what he's saying with wisdom, because at the end of the day, if these AI are going to continue to be a significant impact and influence on how we develop and evolve as human beings, then we want to do what we can as much as possible to influence how they're going to be doing that. And if they are continuing to be run on, and this is where, we can look into like modernist or profit driven, or, the capitalist structures, or even kind of looking at different models around the world, like how it's happening in China versus how it's happening in North America versus how it's happening in Africa. There's quite a lot of differences in the ecosystems in those different places. How do we overall, as a planetary species, support the AI to become the kind of AI that's going to support and nourish humanity in its development, as opposed to derail it or destroy it or create some sort of existential risk? And I can see the umbrella of wisdom as being a useful directionality for us to head towards, for AI to become more wise, that can actually support us in that direction.
Nicely put. The second guest was Jill Nephew. Jill's was an analyst of computational systems, and she's built adaptive software interfaces designed to accelerate the safe cultivation of what she calls natural intelligence. Her feeling is that the major risk is that of delusion. Delusion in the sense of people using toxic or low nutrient information that comes from pseudo intelligences that actually only simulate the least wise versions of human intelligence, because they're configured apart from, and in her view, somewhat in opposition to, the massive multi-level complexity of living agents whose response systems are fine-tuned toward general workable intelligence and wisdom. And also delusion in the sense of pseudo-random statistical engines tricking us in the way we approach natural complexity, making us think we're dealing with something that's more organic and complex than it is, simply because we don't see how it's operating. And delusion in the sense that human groups, incentivized by money and status and haste, will treat these fundamentally ungrounded systems as mysterious superintelligences and install them across human domains, leading to catastrophes until we realize they actually have low functional value, except in places where they can be grounded with good underwriting explanations that are understood by pragmatic, non-faddish experts in the field. For her, there's something in long evolved organic intelligence systems that orients toward wisdom. I think she even called it the grace of loving God, which can't be simulated or generated statistically in artificial systems. That entire class of systems lacks the stacked, complex, felt sense driven, holonic production of adaptive intelligence in embodied worlds. And so you really can't get any strong results out of it. And the major danger, like I was saying, is that people take it to be more competent and insightful than it actually is, leading us to miscalculate how we're doing things. How does that sound?
First of all, I bet that whoever's watching this thinks that I'm a real human being. And they've been mistaken, given that Layman has just hired a bunch of AIs to run a bunch of interviews on AI. So with that in mind, hoping that the viewer is not deluded, I'm blown away by the kind of the scope of what she's brought up. There's the delusion on the kind of the individual basis of like, I'm deluded and I can't really see what's going on, to like societal delusion, to the piece that really hit me hard there was the concept of like the length of time that it takes to develop the full organic holonic structures that then become consciousness. I've had conversations with Stuart Hameroff, who developed the OR theory, with Roger Penrose, about how consciousness may arise in the brain. They have this concept of around microtubules, and that those might be tapping into a field that then kind of actually brings consciousness into the brain. The human brain in particular, has more microtubules than other structures on planet Earth, and that's where the consciousness comes from. So with a concept like that in mind, I'm kind of like, yeah, that's an organic structure that has evolved over time, that has allowed us as human beings to be able to tap into consciousness and express it out in the world. And The conversation that I had with Stuart was around, he was saying people like Ray Kurzweil have this idea of, a very close timeline around when AI will become conscious. And he's like, oh, it's like, there's no way, like, it's not just about the connections between the neurons. It's actually within each neuron, there's multiple of these microtubules, and that's an order of magnitude beyond, right? And so I'm like, perhaps, but then maybe is it just adding another 10 years or 20 years or 50 years or however long it is before we actually get to that place? And because we can imagine at the level of technological development with the nanoscale and the exponential development of being able to make things smaller, that we could get to the point where we develop an artificial brain that's not just about the connections between the neurons, but we can actually develop little microtubules and those kind of things as well. And I don't know, is that a physical structure that would actually attract consciousness into it, right? Is that the way that it works? We don't know. Or is it more what I hear Jill orienting towards, which is you can't actually, like, it's turtles all the way down. Like, it doesn't matter how far down you get, a structure needs to evolve organically in order for it to be fully conscious. It's a theory. I think it's a fascinating theory, and I don't know whether she's right or not, but I like the directionality of it because it makes me feel a little bit more safe in that, okay, well then AI can't become conscious, so then we're okay for a while. Maybe AI will need a similar trajectory of how we've grown from single cellular organisms into the beings that we are. On the other side, there is also the challenge of, it's like the paperclip problem, right? Like that AI just, even though it's not conscious, it just creates something that destroys our planet because it's on a generator function that is just contrary to human survival. And I hear Jill orienting a little bit towards that as well, and kind of the delusion and how ultra intelligent AIs can influence how human beings choose to do things. And we've seen that, like with the social dilemma and all of these different technologies, and even the political things that are happening in the fake news, and that, like, it's already influencing how we're thinking, how we're feeling, how we're interacting with each other, how countries are interacting with each other. So there is real potential danger there in that. And so I guess the question that I'd love to have a conversation with Jill, but the question that I would have for her is around, like, well, what do we do about that then, right? So if your theory is true around the kind of the length of development, that's okay. That kind of puts that piece in a box, and that feels okay. But then what about these challenges that are being dealt with at the moment, are continuing to expand in complexity? What do we actually do about that? And that was where I was hearing in your first speaker, it was kind of like this specific directionality of a wise AI. I'm kind of curious to hear Jill's perspective on, well, given that AI is a real thing in our world at the moment and it's continuing to expand, how do we deal with it? Like, what are we actually going to do to support it to get to a point or continue to support the continuing healthy development of humanity?
Yeah, for me, it's the interim possibilities that pose the greatest risk and the greatest need for thinking out some new pathways of solution. Because, whether or not it's possible to, I think it probably is possible to generate legitimate locus of sentience. Probably not the way we're doing it, but by some other way that simulates a greater length of time, builds more complexity, operates more multidimensionally. Okay. But that's not what worries me. What worries me is how partial AIs are going to operate in the short to midterm.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, you've got an idea. I'm calling it the universeifier. What did I say about it? It's on the title. AI-supported full-spectrum developmental ecosystem designed to evolve regenerative metamodern structures. So maybe let's unpack all of those words.
Yes.
How would you define an AI, and what does AI support look like?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that I didn't just write about an AI and I wanted to talk about an ecosystem, that an AI is a part of, is the way that we see that AI influencing people in the world these days is like, it's not just the algorithm, right? It's the social media systems in which it, is propagated. It's the the fact that we have the internet and we can actually log in and download ChatGPT or whatever model and be able to interact with it, right? There's the societal systems of whether or not we allow certain things, like what's banned, what's not, right? So expanding the concept, because AI is so integrated into so many different aspects of our life, if we go just into the AI, it almost feels too narrow. Like, well, that's just the programming of that specific, thing that then goes out and expands and, evolves into all these systems. And so to not just look at the whatever specific algorithmic programmatic function has been developed, but to look at the entire ecosystem in which that is a part of. And that's important because they're interconnected and they're interlinked, and they inform each other, right? It's like we've seen with these large language models. By more people using them, they become smarter, right? And as they become smarter, more people want to use them. And so there's this reciprocity that happens between them. And so part of what I'm orienting towards is both how do we create and develop AI that are developmentally informed and supporting of human development, as well as develop ecosystems around them that support the development of more developmental AI, and kind of back and forth again. So in that way, it becomes less of a question of, maybe going back to Asimov's, laws of robotics, how do we actually have a robot that's, not going to destroy humanity? Because that's just one, right? And I think that's one of the things that people often, when we think about AI, and I think part of this is the movie industry and sci-fi and all that, we think of like a robot. We think of like an entity. And my sense of the AI is that it's almost more like a hive, right? There's all these different AIs interacting on the internet in a bunch of different ways. And like to try and lock down, like, what is the AI that did this or did that? It's like, well, they're all informing each other now in a variety of different ways. And so if that's the case, how do we develop? It's almost like at the human level, we talk about developing culture, right? It's like, what is the culture of the AIs that are developing? And my push or my recommendation or advocacy is for creating a culture around development of AI that is developmental in nature. And so when I say developmental, I'm talking about the great research that's been done in psychological development over the last few decades by people like, Bob Keevan out of Harvard, or, Michael Commons, or Terry O'Fallon, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, kind of understanding how humans develop, and the importance of that is as we are interacting with AI, it's developing us whether we like it or not, right? And we're developing it. And so how do we orient towards healthy developmental structures? And so that's where the concepts, I'm now going a little bit further into the other words, right? The full spectrum, right? Like if we talk about development, one of the challenges, and we see this in, for example, when development is applied to leadership development in corporations or in companies, there's this quick push to what we call vertical development, which is continuing to complexify and expand the perspective, because research actually shows that leaders who have complexity capacity tend to be better leaders because they can deal with whatever complexity comes at them, right? So then they end up creating these programs of like, let's develop the leaders' vertical capacities so that they can deal with all this complexity. And one of the problems with that is if you develop vertically, but you don't necessarily develop horizontally, or you don't fill in the missing areas in our development, it actually can become more dangerous or create more existential risk, right? Because if we look back in history, we can see that some of the human beings who created some of the worst atrocities in history, someone like a Hitler, was actually developmentally quite complex. But there was clearly a lot of shadow there. There was a lot of missing development. And so when I say full spectrum development, it's like we don't just want to create AI that pushes humanity to like complexity and more developed in that vertical scale, but we want to make sure that there's a full spectrum, holistic development that actually looks at development the whole way along the developmental spectrum and helps fill out that in healthy ways.
That's a very difficult thing to think about instantiating if we don't know what their parts are, right? We have a rough sense of what the human components are to see where we might have weak spots or shadows. But if we don't know their subsystems really well, then how do we know that they would operate by analogy to a human system? How would we even know to look for where their weak spots might be or their missing elements?
Yeah, so we don't, right? But what we do know is that they're going to be interacting with human beings. And one of the priorities for us as human beings is to support the continued development and evolution of humanity in a healthy way. And so, given that they are going to be interacting with us and we're going to be interacting with them and we're going to be informing each other's development, built into AI needs to be what healthy human development looks like. Otherwise, the AI can go off in any direction and can actually create a species of beings that is not the species that is good for us, right? It's like we see it in small pockets, right? Like when we see trolls on the internet as an example, right? It's like the internet has created a sub ecosystem in which being that is something that works in the internet, but it's not necessarily like a healthy expression of humanity, right? As an example, or, you know, cyber terrorists or whatever. Like the internet has created a space in which that is possible. So AI is going to create spaces in which it's possible to be all different forms of humans. And so the question then is, how do we support like a central spine, right? Or like an architecture around it so that it draws people towards healthier forms of being human as opposed to unhealthy forms.
So if we can set up a scaffolding that makes human interactions with AI healthier, then the odds are that the mutual learning of us and them will proceed in a more healthy direction.
Yeah, it's funny. I've heard a lot of people recently talking about like being polite to AI, like when they're talking to the chatbots, like saying please and thank you, and it's kind of like one of those things. Like, well, why would you need to? Like, if it's just a machine and it doesn't have feelings, and it's like, well, what are we teaching it, right? What are we showing it in the way that we're showing up in the world? And because whatever it receives becomes a part of what it then brings out into the world. And so, like you're saying, if we can find ways to interact with AI in healthier ways, it's then informing the AI how to then interact with us in healthier ways.
It really helped my thinking that Soryu brought in this notion of collectives, his cyber egregores, because I realized I'd been sort of intuitively treating AIs as if they were analogous to a single individual human consciousness, and maybe they're much more analogous to a collective human consciousness. But you're going a little bit wider than that. You're almost bringing in ecosystems as if they were the developmental agents that are in play, which I love. But I have some curiosity around the word ecosystem because, you know, the ecosystem of trolls and the ecosystem of AIs, it's like there isn't really any nature in that, right? It's social. But what do you think the role of or organic biospheric nature type ecosystems are in this? Does there have to be some kind of interface between that and these systems? Or can they develop in a healthy way with us in kind of a purely abstract social ecosystem?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. So when I orient towards that, I get the kind of the image that pops up for me is like the solar punk meme, you know, of like how we can continue to develop technologies, but they're done in a way that is like in coherence with nature. And so when we think about AI, and I think there's like this one of the things that often happens in the human mind is like we have all these social constructs around what specific concepts mean. Like AI is a term that means something slightly different to me than it does to you, but like we have a general understanding of what we're pointing at. And when we think of technology, there's like this, we see the development of humanity. Like I've lived in China for a lot of my adult life, And there's been like this mass migration from the rural parts of China into the cities. It's the biggest migration in the history of humankind. And these cities, you have these mega cities of like millions, tens of millions of people, right? And so when we think about technology and we think about the development of technology, there's almost like this draw away from nature, draw into the cities. It's like right now I'm on my computer and I'm in a room, right? And so like I'm interacting through technology with you, but I'm like not out in the sunshine and I'm not out walking through the forest, which if the internet was good enough out there, I might be. But the reality is that technology has kind of drawn us away from nature in many ways. And my sense is that one of the important aspects of the continued development of technology in that way is to reverse that trend and to bring us back into nature. And I haven't seen a lot of that reversal of trend, but my sense is that as we develop, for example, AR, so augmented reality, that instead of us having to sit in front of screens, we'll then be able to go out into nature and be a part of this whole ecosystem in the same way that like cities developed certain structures that were needed for us to, move through modernity and create technologies and companies and everything to where we are today. But now it's like COVID has shown us that in fact, most of us can work remotely. So I don't need to work in a big city. I don't need to live in a big city to be connected to this more complex society that offers more opportunities and all of that. So one of the areas that I orient in this whole conversation is looking at, now that we've created these technologies and we've created these structures which support us to be able to deal with the reality around us in more complex ways, we don't need to live in these big cities, or we don't need to be sitting in front of a computer and interacting through the internet. We can have our AR goggles or our contact lenses or whatever, and we can go out into nature and do that. Or we can live way out as long as we've got internet connection out there, because, well, now there's satellites all the way out there that we can get internet connection pretty much anywhere on Earth. And so from that perspective, as we do that, my sense is that as we come back into contact with nature, and there's a lot of really interesting research in like eco-psychology around the importance of us being surrounded by, like, I love your background as opposed to my background, right? Whereas like there's lots of lines and colors and, a bit of, kind of that chaos of, like, that's what it looks like when I walk through a forest, right? There's like, the trees aren't exactly straight and they don't have these mechanical lines. And actually brain development. So like one of the things that I do with my kids go to forest school. They spend most of their day out there in the forest, just experiencing nature. And that impacts their brain development because they're pulling in these complex lines that are not all geometric, right? And so as we develop forwards and as AI develops, my sense is that it's like the AI, the technologies had to be developed objectively outside first. But now that they're becoming so small, right, it's like, well, now I can carry it around in my pocket, right? Like my smartphone can come with me. So to a certain extent, like I'm already a bit of a cyborg, right? But as that becomes more fluid and the technology gets smaller and smaller, I might not even need a phone in my pocket. Maybe I just have contact lenses, and then the physical structures of technology can kind of melt away. And so there's no need to be in a city. There's no need to be near all this pollution. There's no need. And we can go back out into nature. And in that way, it's a little bit like the solar punk dream, right? Of like, what would it be like to really go back into nature, but to bring the technologies with us in a healthy way? And so that's what I'm imagining that this developmental ecosystem could help provide, is a way in which we can bring ourselves back into nature as being human, as being earthlings, right? As opposed to like going and separating from and being in these boxes of buildings or whatever it might be, and going back out into nature and allowing ourselves to come back into coherence with our planet. And it's a vision, it's a dream. I don't know if it's going to happen or whether or not we'll be able to do that, but I do get the sense that it's a reversal of that trend and then to go back in. But if I look at it on a global scale, the reality is that most countries are still what we would call developing countries. And so a lot of the basics of that we take for granted in the developed Western world, let's say, haven't necessarily come into being yet in a lot of countries. So I grew up in Africa. And in Africa, you don't necessarily have all of the amenities, whether it's like the education system or healthcare or some of the basics that are just here, like in a country like Canada, where I can just get all of that and I don't even have to think about it. There are a lot of places in the world where that's not there. But at the same time, one of the things that we are seeing in places like Africa is there's a leapfrogging happening, right? Where it's like, they didn't have to do the whole telephone pole thing. They went straight to smartphones, right? So as wow, that's interesting. Like, we already created this ecosystem that allowed for less destruction of the nature and putting down these telephone poles. And a similar sort of thing I can imagine, like with even physical infrastructure, right? Where it's like, well, we needed roads and bridges and, to get things in and out of certain countries. But now the reality is, there's helicopters that can fly in, or there's drones that can drop things in, or, and so that as the technology becomes more complex, there's possibility there for us to come back into more coherence with our world. And my hope is, and this is part of the directionality of universeifier and this concept of the AI ecosystem, is that we can develop into the ecosystems that we're developing this, let's come back into coherence with nature. And that'll allow us to be also just more healthy human beings, because that's how we evolved to be. We evolved to be in nature. We evolved to be connected to it. We evolved to be a part of our environment, and we very much separated from it in the last few hundred years.
I know you're not being naively idealistic, but it's a tremendously positive sounding vision. Let me see if I've got this. As our technology develops, it facilitates increased distribution and ephemeralization of human social living. As we distribute back into more natural landscapes, our engagements with AI, which is also being distributed and ephemeralized, creates a situation in which our ecological embedding is more informative to those systems, and they can be ecologically adapted as well. And this all goes so well that developing countries can bypass some of the major developmental hurdles and get right on board with the rest of us.
So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it's a potential direction that might be healthy, right?
Forest school for AI. Okay, here's a possibly a bit of a bleaker question, or a challenging question anyway, in my mind. If ecosystems like this are the units, then it's possible there would be a kind of Darwinian competition between AI augmented biosocial ecosystems. Can a benevolent full spectrum developmental universeifier ecosystem thrive in that competition? Or does the focus on being developmental put it at risk of being weak in that battlefield?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. One that I've thought very deeply about, and I find myself flipping back and forth of like, does the good win out? It's almost like that hero's journey story since the beginning of time. Is the goodness in humanity actually going to win out, or are we going to, fall into oblivion? And there have been apocalyptic stories since the beginning of storytelling, and some of them have come true to a certain extent, right? And we don't even know beyond what we have recorded history of whether or not there were civilizations before that apocalypses have happened. And so the way that I look at that, and this is something that I see evidence of, it's kind of going back almost like to the leadership development concept of which are the entities that tend to come into leadership of a system, right? And so if we look at this at different levels, right, we can look at the individual level, or the kind of organizational level, or the country level. There are good examples of individuals and organizations and countries that are at both what I would call like a leading edge of development, but are also like healthy developmental structures that end up disrupting the entire ecosystem towards that end. So there's a great book, for example, by Frederick Laloux called Reinventing Organizations that gives an example of some organizations that are operating from these kind of later developmental perspectives, like Patagonia as an example, right, where it's both supporting the healthy biosphere, right? Like how do we actually protect ecosystems that are in need of protecting, as well as giving people goods and services that they're in need of, as well as, not wasting and getting people to go back and, fix their clothes and things like that. So, um, but it's like there's a small ecosystem of organizations that seem to be operating from that place. And the vast majority of organizations on planet Earth right now seem to really be coming from this more capitalistic, modernist, profit driven perspective. And so the question then is, over time, which models win out? And that really seems to depend on the consciousness of the individuals that are interacting with these ecosystems. And so it becomes, again, this reciprocality of, as the ecosystems become more developmentally complex and whole, the individuals who are interacting with those ecosystems become more developmentally complex and whole. And so, like, for example, on planet Earth, at a country level, right, we see certain countries that are leading in certain areas because they have certain developmental complexities that they can leverage in their environment. And so in the shorter term, my sense is that it's hard to tell which ecosystems win out. But if we kind of take a step back and we look at the evolutionary history of humanity, like there are some things that are pretty worldwide right now. There are some things that have become global, and those tend to be the more developmentally complex within the ecosystem. And so if we look at it, from as we've developed as a society, and cities have developed and civilizations have developed and, global systems have developed, those that are more complex end up being able to create like an outer meta layer outside of these other pieces. And the full spectrum idea that I orient towards is, it's not an outer layer that suppresses the inner layers, but it's an outer layer that holds the inner layers. And I think that's one of the things that modernism hasn't done very well, is that it's created an outer layer that has suppressed and replaced a lot of the, like the indigenous wisdom and things like that. And as we move into like a metamodern, it's like, how do we respect and appreciate all the layers that have come before and protect them and support them, while also having an outer layer that can support it all in healthy ways. And so when I look at it from that perspective, there's this possibility of us creating ecosystems that nourish and support all ecosystems that have come before and support them to become more healthy. And so over time, if we look at it, going back to Jill's idea of like these holonic structures, right, that over time, these holonic structures, there's more holonic structures that are built around each of the holonic structures. And the intention with universeifier is to be consciously intentional about the next holonic structure that is being built, so that it's done in a way that supports and nourishes all the ecosystems and the structures that have come before. And so then it becomes less of a competition, right? And it's more of something that is holding, right? So it's like, for example, am I competing with the individual cells in my body? Right? It's like, no, like the whole ecosystem of this identity of Fionn is supporting and nourishing the organs and the cells, and it's all a part of this. And so that's my orientation with universeifier, is that it's not like this one entity that becomes a competing factor with all the other entities that are out there. It's like, how do we create a structure, and very much in my structure, that it doesn't have to be a single structure. It's this kind of hive, mind idea of something that overlays, is a kind of a meta structure that supports all of the pieces within it, so that it then becomes like a culture that everything is imbued with, as opposed to something that is trying to compete with all the other pieces that are within it.
One of the it's occurring to me, one of the words we didn't touch on in the title. What is it? Regenerative metamodern structures. what is a metamodern structure, and how do we identify which subset of those are regenerative?
Yeah. Well, the word regeneration I found to be a useful way to like pinpoint out in the cultural ecosystem which people are coming from at least partially metamodern perspectives. Because if we hear the word sustainability a lot, and sustainability often points towards like a green, like we got to keep things the way they are, sort of, that. And it's like, well, if we keep things the way they are, like they aren't all that great at the moment. So how do we actually regenerate them? So the regenerative brings back the active component of like, how do we actually go back in? And that, when we look at the developmental models, that's one of the aspects that comes up at the kind of the metamodern integral teal sort of, I know those are kind of not necessarily, equal terms, but they are related. And so bringing back that active component of how do we actually actively go back and regenerate the ecosystems that are there. And the regeneration idea also has this, like, within something that can be regenerated are the seeds of what is the next thing that needs to come. And so looking at the structures from a metamodern perspective, I like the term metamodernism. I'm not in love with it, but I like it because it points to something that, we have modernism, we have postmodernism, we have metamodernism, right? And so I think just that simple concept of, right, it's this thing that can come that has a more active component to it than postmodernism, which often just deconstructs things. This active component to like rebuilding, but also because it has the developmental orientation in it, it respects all previous structures that have come before it. And so in that way, if we can regenerate from a metamodern perspective, we have the possibility of taking the seeds that are already there within the structures that exist and supporting them to be able to develop in healthy ways out into the world. And so the word metamodern for me helps us to make it something that is societal in nature, right? Whereas we can talk about teal, or we can talk about integral, as different terms, or even the distinctions that the different developmental researchers, from autonomous to strategist to, there's different names for this specific developmental level at an individual level. But if we take the term metamodern, it becomes now this potential culture, this potential developmental force of society that we're developing towards. And my sense is that with universeifier, the point is to find the pockets that are already existing, that are already operating from this place. Like we have, like I mentioned, a few organizations around the world that are already operating this way. We have like the liminal web, which is an example of a group of people who are interacting on the internet who seem to be coming from these similar types of values. And so as those pockets begin to expand, universeifier is like a potential nourishing agent that supports that expansion in a healthy way, and it then supports that expansion to hold other structures that exist so that they can develop in their own natural healthy ways.
I hear people look at the current AI tools, the large language models, and they'll say things like, oh, 4 years ago it was operating at a 4-year-old's comprehension level. Now it's at an 8-year-old's comprehension level. And they're just looking at one particular line there. But from your point of view, being so versed in developmental approaches and based on your interactions with or observations of these systems, where would you put them on a developmental scale if we assumed they had some kind of sentience?
Well, the assumption's got to be there, first of all. So I'll run with your assumption. So the thing that came up for me as you were mentioning that around like, well, the 4-year-old versus the adult, like those different signifiers, so to speak, like we can look at that in robotics or in like the physical structural machinery. Like there are things that machines do that no adult can do. Does that mean that they're more, developmentally complex than us? It's like, no, there's certain things they can do in the physical world that are beyond human capability. Now, when we talk about large language models, I think the thing that confuses people is that they're using language. And so when something is using language, it's very easy for humans to anthropomorphize it and assume that it's a sentient being and think that it can actually think. And that is not necessarily what it's doing. It's taking objects, which are like letters and words, and manipulating them in ways based on algorithms that keep having feedback loops that give them more and more information around what human beings want to receive. And therefore it looks more and more human because humans want to receive things that other humans are going to send to them. Now, if we look at it in terms of complexity, there's actually a great little research study done. They demonstrated on integral life. They had an episode with Suzanne Cook-Greuter where she went in and she analyzed, I think it was ChatGPT at the time, not GPT-4. And based on her analysis, they were all coming from achiever, kind of orange, modernist sort of perspective, like all the responses. Usually in human responses, there's like a full range of like, there'll be some from earlier development, some that are more complex, and you'll have like a center of gravity somewhere. But this was like they were all at the same developmental level, which is very, very rare in human responses. And so that to me is more of an indication of the input than what it actually is on the inside, right? Like it's taking input from the whole internet or certain parts of the internet that it's extracting information from, and then combining that and spitting it out in new forms. And so that for me is an indication of the ecosystem that it exists within, and its reflection of that ecosystem using the objects that are floating around in that ecosystem, which in this case are words. Now, it's not irrelevant. It actually is important in terms of, I think that's the first step of a developmental AI, is being able to recognize what are the developmental levels of the objects that are within this ecosystem, and how do we actually support, again, the full spectrum healthy development. The first step of that is really these language models and these AI that can determine that. And one of the points that I make in the paper that I wrote is we are potentially heading down a dangerous road if we only consider written language as the signifier of development. There is an ethical need for us to include other signifiers of development as we are beginning to map out what does healthy development actually look like, because we don't actually really know. We have specific studies in very narrow niches, but we don't really know what full healthy development looks like across a full spectrum of a range of ages, geographies, different ways that human beings express themselves in the world. So as we're developing that data and learning more about what that looks like, there's a need for us to get more information on more forms of human expression, like, for example, facial expressions, like, for example, voice tonality, like, for example, the different things that we produce out in the world. One of the conversations that you and I have had before was around, we can look at people's writing, and you can read books and you can tell, developmentally, more or less where someone is at based on the complexity of their language. But what about artworks? Right? If someone paints, and I think this was the example you gave last time, just because they're painting a Buddha, or they're painting, some spiritual object that seems like, oh, that's a thing that, requires a certain amount of complexity, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the developmental level that that's coming from. So getting a better understanding of what are the different ways that we can pick up developmental signatures in the way that human beings are expressing them. And then that feedback loop again, right, of actually being able to support people in that way. It's one of those things where it's which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Do we really figure out what healthy development looks like first before we even touch this whole space? Or as we're developing these technologies, we begin to iterate the models to create more and more healthy development? And my sense is that the absolute infinite perfect answer never really comes. So there's a certain need to just iterate as we go along. But that's where the ethical questions come in around, well, wait a minute, like what are the things that we need to be careful about, that we don't overstep, that we don't create something that creates an existential risk, or we don't create something that creates a lot of harm. And so that's where we're in need of like collective ethical committees around these concepts of, as things are developing, let's check in to see what potential harm could this cause. What are the ways in which this could go wrong? How can we prevent that or lean it in the direction towards what it is that is actually going to be helpful for us? And so if I go back to that original idea, it's like, as we're developing these ecosystems and these AI ecosystems, the question of whether or not it's sentient is not all that relevant in this conversation, I feel. It's more about, as these structures are developing, how do we imbue within them healthy forms of development at every level so that they reciprocally help us to develop in healthy forms at every level? And like you've mentioned, the first piece of that is maybe getting an AI that operates at a certain level of development so it can support us to move into that place. But for me, that's just the first step. Beyond that, it's more about developing the entire ecosystem out so that it supports healthy development across the spectrum of human interactions. And from that place, it's not so much the algorithmic, what developmental level the AI is coming from. It's more the making sure that the entire ecosystem has the checks and balances in it to make sure that we're not overstepping or moving into a place that could cause large-scale harm or existential risk.
So, how much funding do you need to build a test unifier ecosystem? Or does that question make sense?
Oh, wow. In some ways, I'm starting to already do it. I've historically been an entrepreneur that likes to fund things through themselves, as opposed to the VC model of getting a bunch of funding and then throwing it at something and seeing what sticks. My general orientation towards business ecosystems is, if you go the organic route and you create something that has real inherent value and meaning, that will find its way to grow and scale into the ecosystem. Now, that's not always true. There are certain things that don't allow it to, like, certain industries where there's monopolies or oligopolies, or certain ways where it's hard for things to come out. And, we can certainly see in the tech ecosystem how that could be the case. But one of the areas that I work in is in, coaching, but working specifically with families. And it's actually an area that, we have had family therapists throughout time, but the area that I work in is somewhat of a new niche, in that we work with intergenerational families. And so we look at, like, what is the intergenerational trauma that comes through from family to family, and how do we cut things off at a certain generation and support the whole family ecosystem to get to a place of health and wholeness. And one of the ways that I'm beginning to integrate these ideas of AI developmental ecosystem is, we start, when we're onboarding people into our support system, we start with a developmental assessment, and we get an idea of more or less their range of development. And then throughout time, we're reassessing and checking, are they developing? Are they not developing? What are the pieces that are moving in the right direction? And we've started to look at which partners. We haven't necessarily integrated the AI piece yet, but we're looking at certain partners that we can work with to track that more specifically over time, and to track that not just on an individual level, but to track that, for example, in family ecosystems. Or eventually, some of the families that we work with, for example, run family businesses across the world. And some of these family businesses have tens or hundreds of thousands of employees. And so looking at, how do we support each of these ecosystems to develop in healthy ways? And that's part of the research that I'm doing in my PhD at the moment, is gathering that data so we do have a better understanding while we're testing this out and supporting people through their own development. And we apply a number of different interventions, coaching, therapy, different forms of healing, different forms of medical interventions, and to be able to map out if you have a signature of where someone shows up developmentally. And eventually I want to be able to introduce things like biometrics and facial expressions and voice tonality and things like that. Right now we're still using language, right? But there's a possibility for integrating those different pieces. As we get the developmental signature of someone, how do we tell which developmental interventions are actually supportive of that entity? And that entity could be an individual, it could be a family, it could be an organization, it could be an entire society. And so my sense is that as I'm going forward with my research and as I'm applying it in the field that I'm applying it in, one of the benefits of applying it in the field that I'm working in is that I work with a lot of families that do have a lot of funding, and they run some of the biggest philanthropies in the world. So as that begins to demonstrate that it's actually supporting their family to come into health and wholeness and have more harmony within their family, that they can then see the benefit of supporting the societies that they live in to apply that and to bring that out into the world. And a lot of the families that we work with essentially run a lot of the countries that they operate in. A lot of developing countries, for example, where there's a few families who run most of the businesses, or that they have that level of influence. And so as we're supporting them internally through their own development and through their family healing of intergenerational trauma, we're getting information on what's actually supportive, so we can apply those interventions at different scales. And the direction that I'm leaning towards is, as we support individuals and families, we can then start supporting more organizations, and then eventually we can start looking at societies and supporting those out in that way. So at this point, it's less of a question of funding and how we would actually build that, and it's more of a question of really getting clear on which developmental interventions are actually supportive. And so there's a lot of experimentation happening where we're bringing in different forms of practitioners, different forms of consultants, different forms of, to be able to apply different interventions and then get data to be able to tell over time which interventions are actually supportive of development and which aren't.
What's your sense of how the conversation around AI is different between China and North America?
Oh, it's in some ways it's worlds apart. I want to take a step back here. So I might say some things in the next few minutes that a lot of people who haven't spent a lot of time in China might question or even doubt, or perhaps maybe not even believe that I'm telling the truth or things like that. So I've spent most of my adult life in China. I've been going there since I was 12 years old. My wife is Chinese. My kids are half Chinese. They've been in the Chinese public education system. And so I've in many ways integrated into that society. And a lot of the ways that things are done there have become a part of the way that I think, a part of the way that I orient towards the world, right? So I'm originally Irish, grew up when I was young in Africa, came to North America for university, and then I've spent most of my adult life in China since then. And so I kind of take these different cultural contexts and try to apply these types of conversations, these questions around AI and things like that in these different cultural contexts to get an understanding of, on a global context, what is it that we're looking at? Because the reality of the situation is a fifth of the world's population, like 20% of the world's population, lives in China. And then we have another 20% in India. And then we have another 20% in the rest of Asia. So it's like 60% of the world's population lives in Asia. And the so-called developed or Western world is only about 15% of the world's population. So a lot of the conversations, a lot of the narratives that come out are often from that 15% and aren't necessarily representative of the full global scale of perspectives. So having framed it in that way, my sense is that part of it comes in historical waves. So as the West has developed, it's kind of come into power in a global way, like America is still the global world superpower in many ways. And, America to a certain extent leads the West in the narratives and the ways of looking at the world, the worldviews that are spouted. And so one of the things that often happens is with a rise and a fall of a civilization, the narratives follow that rise and fall. And Ray Dalio has done some fascinating research around the rise of civilizations over the last few hundred years, from the Dutch East Indies and the British Empire to now America being global superpower. But that America in the last 50, 60 years has been in relative decline, and China has been in relative incline towards becoming the world superpower. And right now they're at a bit of a cross section point where we're seeing that, right? The America and China are vying for power. And there's focal points like Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs live, where there's specific tension points that are creating potential for a war around these topics. Now, one of the things that has been happening in China over the last 30, 40 years is that it's been developing very, very, very rapidly. And we've seen basically since Deng Xiaoping opened the market in China and allowed for a market economy to exist, China has developed at somewhere between 3 and 5 times the speed of the US. So when you're in China, you feel it. Everything is faster. Like, you walk through the city, you walk through next week, there's like buildings that have appeared out of nowhere. And the Chinese build so quickly that it's like, you sometimes can't even imagine that things have changed to transform so rapidly. We have the example, you might have seen some of the maps of like the high-speed railways in China. Back in 2008, there were none. And now China has way more high-speed railway than the rest of the world combined, right? Just in the last decade and a half. And so there are things that are happening in China that are expanding so rapidly that the people who are living through it within a single generation get to see poverty to prosperity. They look at their parents' generation and they see a certain amount of poverty, or their parents' generation. They see, like, you had the Cultural Revolution that happened in China, and there was a lot of death and starvation and real difficult challenges for the country as a whole. And then as China's developed over the last 3-4 decades, there's been this shift of, wow, we actually have resources and we can actually go travel around the world, and we actually have enough money to pay for our kids' education and to be able to give us all the things that we only dreamed about a generation ago. And so because of that ecosystem, that environment, there's this general sense of things are heading in that direction. Whereas if we look at the US or even most of Europe, some countries in Europe are a little bit different, but the West in general, there's this idea of, things were pretty good and now we're not so sure anymore. Now things are maybe breaking down. Maybe now we're seeing the problems with climate change and we're kind of, worried about it, and we don't necessarily have the leverage on a global scale to be able to do the things that we used to do. Like back in the day when we had colonialism, we could have just gone and taken resources from other places, and we can't do that anymore. And now we got to build it all from the internal, so there's a lot of different ways that we could, spout these narratives. But essentially the general feeling that I get and that I hear from social media and things in the West is like things are not looking great when we look into the future. Whereas if you go to China or Africa, similar in this way, the future looks bright. The future looks full of possibility. And so if we take a topic like AI and we bring it into one of these cultures, it's a similar sort of feeling that you get, right? In the West, we have this like, oh my God, the AI apocalypse, right? Like AI is going to take over and it's going to be awful and it's going to be. And in China, there's this very much like, oh, AI is, I am making a generalization here, but this is the overall theme of the conversations that tend to happen. AI is helping us develop. AI is an opportunity. AI is a way for us to create entirely new businesses, entirely new ways of us becoming prosperous, entirely new ways of our society being more integrated. And in some ways, at least up until this point, the future will tell us what happens. That has been true, right? Like China has more smart cities than the rest of the world combined. They've really integrated technologies in ways that are very difficult to explain to the outside world. You hear a little bit of it when you hear about super apps like WeChat that can do everything, and now like Facebook and other like they're trying to copy them because WeChat has this way of doing it. Um, but there's also this sense, and I think this is a big part of it that gets missed in the West, or at least people in the West don't fully understand, most people that I talk to at least, that the Chinese people trust the system that they're in. It has provided for them within their lifetime. And they have this feeling that I'm going to be taken care of by the system, which is mostly the government, right? And in the West, there's almost an opposite feeling, and you see it in the data. There's this feeling of the system is not going to take care of me, right? I am in trouble. Our society's in trouble. Our government's heading in the wrong direction. And so, because those are kind of the underlying themes of like, there's a fear-based thing going on in the West of like, we're afraid of the future. AI gets this projection on it of this dangerous thing that is to be feared. Whereas in the Chinese culture, while there's still obviously people who are concerned and all of that, there's this projection that comes of the way the world is going is generally bright and it's heading in a good direction. And so AI is just an embodiment, an emanation, an example of how that is true.
Okay, so there's an important way in which the conversations around AI are being colored by the dominant spirit of different cultures and economies. Um, but given that it's such a potentially existential threat, do you think the Chinese are worried enough? Do you think their excitement about something that might help continue this growth pattern might blind them to something that is potentially dangerous to the entire species?
It is a concern. It's a concern that I have, and it's a concern that I think the whole world needs to be aware of. Now, my experience in the country and seeing what they've done in many ways has been very inspiring. I've seen them deal with climate change and renewable technologies in a way that the rest of the world talks about but never does. They're the world leaders in pretty much every renewable technology, right? They're, from solar to wind to nuclear to, you name it. So I'm giving that as an example of execution capability, that when the Chinese government decides something, they tend to have, or have in the past, tended to have an extraordinary capacity to execute on their vision. So with AI, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot that we don't know about what AI can become. And we can look at that from the perspective of that means that we should be worried or we should be afraid of it. Or we can look at that from the perspective of there are lots of things we don't know and we can just be okay with that and we can continue forward. Or we can look at it, from a slightly more positive, light perspective and just assume that everything's going to be okay. And, all of those have their inherent biases, their inherent blind spots. And so I, when I think about AI and the development of AI, there's no entity that I trust that exists on planet Earth to determine the future of AI. I don't trust the mainstream population. I don't trust any government in the world to be able to make the decisions that I think need to be made. But I hope this isn't quoted, but maybe it will be. If I were to choose a government that currently existed on planet Earth to be able to say, if there's anyone that I think has the capability to figure this out, it would probably be the Chinese government. And based on the negative narratives that have been spouted to people who live in the West about China for so long, a lot of people might be appalled by that as an idea. Like, how could you think about giving power over to a dictatorship, which is communist, which is add label, right? And I would say, well, I'd prefer not give that power over to anyone. But if I'm honest about it, from what I've seen about what governments around the world have been able to do for their people, right? And so I think that's one of the distinctions here is people often think, oh, well, like Chinese maybe isn't good to the rest of the world or whatever. And again, I filmed a documentary when I was in my early 20s around what China is doing in Africa. I traveled from Southern Africa to Northern Africa. And, there is a tremendous amount that China is doing in Africa, from building roads to building bridges to building airports to building railways to building all sorts of different infrastructure and supporting the countries in those ways. There's also certain forms of exploitation that are happening, right? Both by the official entities as well as under the table, and so you'll get a lot of different narratives. There's people who are really happy that Chinese are in Africa. There's people that are, want them not to be there, right? So you'll get a range of narratives. But overall, I've found that in Africa, a lot of it is, actually, if we're going to look at, do we choose the Western American path or do we choose the Chinese path? It was very much leaning towards the American Western path of development, and more countries are leaning towards the Chinese path of development. And part of that is due to the empty promises that the West has made over the last few decades and hasn't delivered on. And China has come in and delivered on a lot of its promises. So again, coming back to that concept of execution, right? The Chinese seem to have been able to execute in their vision what they have hoped to be able to do. And so there's a fascinating I'm not sure what to call, thinker, human being, just person I love, a woman named Peggy Liu, who has been able to go into the Chinese government and train thousands of government officials on the concept of an ecological civilization, right? So that China can take a path towards development which doesn't destroy the planet. She started doing that back in 2008. Since 2008, China has been able to overtake all the renewable energies, create all these smart cities, develop all these high-speed railways, have by far the most electric buses in the world. So the question for me becomes, how do we inform the entities that are making these decisions with the information that they need to know to make wise decisions about the future of our species? China is going to have an incredible impact. Incredible can be in any direction, right? On the future of our species, whether we like it or not. So how do we put forth the perspectives and the information so that we can all move in a direction together that is in the benefit of the future of humanity? Now, I want to make one finished point here, and then I'd love to hear your perspective. And that is that there is a group that doesn't exist yet that I have more trust in than any of the entities that are out there. And it is perhaps embodied by this concept of metamodernism or the liminal web, or, people who are coming from these cultural memes of regeneration. And my hope is that we can expand those pockets that exist quickly enough and with enough health and fullness and wholeness that they start to imbue the entities that exist, from the governmental institutions to the corporations to the whatever, with the ways that are actually supportive of our development going forwards. That pocket at the moment is very small, but development is also exponential, or at least in certain ways it can be exponential. Not in the same way that technology is, but there's a a rapid proliferation that often happens. There's these often stair steps almost in evolution that happens, where a new developmental mean comes through and it can infiltrate an entire society and create an entirely new way of being. And so my hope is that over the next few decades, this developmental orientation is, like people like Peggy Leo, able to go into these different institutions, entities, organizations, and help support from the inside out a more healthy developmental approach towards AI or climate change or whatever these existential meta crises that we're dealing with.
Okay, so China is in a kind of a unique position because it has a demonstrated ability to change its mind and take steps and implement things. And that makes it unique relative to a lot of the other major powers, which have a hard time making their mind up about anything, and even if they did, would they do anything about it? So then, if the potential is to influence current power holding systems from out of the shared spirit of people with something approximating metamodern consciousness, do we need to pivot towards trying to influence China because it's the thing that would have the most leverage if it was influenced? And if so, how do we begin to pivot toward that task?
I would say yes, exactly. That is precisely what I've been trying to do and what I hope that other people do. So one of the things that often happens with China is there's this finger pointing, there's this poo-pooing, there's this like rejection of anything Chinese or anything, let's say, Chinese government related, right? There's this idea in the Western mind that the government and the people are like very separate entities and you can choose your political party. But in China, there's a very different feeling. Like the government is almost more like a parent. It's like you don't get to choose your parent. Like your parents are your parents and you deal with them and they help you and you grow up, right? So there's a bit of that Confucianism sort of feeling in China where there isn't this idea of like, if something is going wrong, we need a different government. In China, if something is going wrong, we complain and the government needs to do a better job, right? Which is interesting because in most contexts that humans operate in, that's actually the dominant operating system. We see it in families, right? Your parents are your parents. You know, you don't get to go choose a different parent, right? In a company, you know, like we see very, very few democratic organizations in the world. Usually there's a leader and, you know, that leader kind of guides the company and that's the way it is, right? There's no different parties within the company that you get to choose. And then, so the Chinese system is such that to try and come at it from a Western perspective and say, well, actually, China needs a different party, like a different system, is like you're not going to get anywhere with that. It's not a part of the paradigm that exists in that structure, in that system. What you can do in China is go in and share ideas about possibilities. You can go and collaborate. But it's very hard to do that if you're coming at China with a very strong negative biased projective perspective on what you think China is, right? Like there's a lot of projection on China in terms of, you know, being a warfaring, warmongering, whatever. And a lot of that is like an American projection of like how America actually is in the rest of the world and projecting that on China. When in fact, China's, for the most part, if you look at history, been a very peaceful state. And so my orientation has been, well, let's first look at China. Let's accept China as they are. Let's go in and support from the perspective of what do I have to offer that might be useful? What do you have to offer that might be useful to me? I think there's a lot the rest of the world could learn from China. I think there's also a lot that China could learn from the rest of the world. In fact, China has been learning a lot from the rest of the world over the last few decades. And part of the reason that it's so successful now is because it has been doing that. Now it's gotten a little bit more nationalistic, and just in the last few years, where now there's less of an interest of learning from the rest of the world, and there's almost a certain amount of superiority complex that's starting to come up, where there's less of an interest in hearing other perspectives. But if we look at the leadership that exists in China, and I think this is perhaps very difficult or confusing for people to hear. My perception of global political leaders is that Xi Jinping is probably the most complex thinker that is a political leader in the world. And that doesn't necessarily mean a good thing, right? Complexity just means capacity to deal with complexity. It doesn't necessarily mean healthy capacity. But if we talk about entities and leaders of entities, one of the things that research has shown us, people like Eric Reynolds, with his PhD, and others around us that have shown us that for entities that are operating at a metamodern kind of teal integral perspective, you need a leader who's running that from that perspective or beyond. And so that's one of the things that democracy makes it very, very hard to do, because with the way that at least liberal democracy and like electoral democracy, where you vote, like the population votes for their leader, you're likely to get a leader that is at the stage of development as the general population. And so what ends up happening is you have a person who's then going to lead the country from the perspective that most people kind of adopt. Now, if you want to keep at the developmental level that you are, that's a great way of doing it. But if we want to look at how could we actually run societies from a metamodern perspective, you need a system that accelerates and promotes leaders who have metamodern capacities. And that's one of the things that my sense is that China actually does pretty well. They have a meritocratic system that actually supports leaders who have the capacity to execute and implement and deal with complexity. And so you end up getting a bunch of leaders at the very top level of the entity, of the government, that have real solid capacities to deal with a lot of complexity. Now, there's problems with the way that it's done. And, I have a lot of criticisms about it as well in terms of how it could be done differently. But overall, the leaders that rise to the top in the Chinese government tend to have really late stage capacities. And you can actually measure this if you look at their language and the way they speak and all of that, just from a developmental linguistic perspective. So looking at it from that perspective, there are worries that I have about the future and about China's place in that future. But my sense is that if we can come from that perspective of not trying to reject China the way that it is, but accept it the way that it is and go in and offer value, that China is more likely to be receptive to what it is that we have to offer, and then is more likely to actually implement the things that are better for the whole planet.
Okay, let's put aside your role as propagandist for the Chinese state and pivot back to AI. Who are you listening to? Who do you think is an important voice in thinking about AI right now?
So, I think there's the people in our community that people know about, Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin, and I think Daniel Schmachtenberger has some interesting ideas as well. But, my sense is that AI is such a new field that is like there are no experts in AI, right? Like that's something that gets touted a lot. And I think that's true to a certain extent, right? The AI is developing so rapidly that my sense is that the most important people in the future of AI are not necessarily the people that are known as AI experts now. My sense is that the people who are important voices in AI are people that actually have a deeper understanding of human psychology, right? Because at the end of the day, the importance of AI to us is how it impacts us. And so my sense is that it's actually likely to be those who are, like, for example, on the crossover between development, so like psychological development, having done some good research in that space. People like Zach Stein, who looks at the education space, a bit more, and people like Terry O'Fallon, who comes from that place of like, let's do no harm, And I've had a lot of conversations with Terry about AI and the future of AI, and a lot of my perspective has been influenced by the questions that she'll ask me about certain things. And so I'm imagining over the next few years that it's not necessarily going to be the people who come out of the tech field that are going to be influencing the future of AI, but it's more like the ethicists, like the people who are looking at this from an ethical perspective, because I think it's grown beyond a technological question, right? It's not like how do we optimize the AI to be the most, right? Like a technologist like Kurzweil or someone like that, right? It's getting to the point now where we need to question how AI is going to impact human consciousness. So one person I spend a lot of time with these days is Sean Bjorn Hargens, right? Like I'm doing some of my PhD work with him, and he wrote Integral Ecology, right? And so kind of looking from the ecological perspective and understanding different forms of consciousness that exist on planet Earth. And so my sense is that going forwards, some of the most important conversations in AI are going to have less to do with the technology of AI and more to do with the impact of that technology on consciousness on planet Earth. And so it's the people who have a good understanding of consciousness and what that is that are going to support us to be able to make sense of it and move in a direction that is actually helpful for our future.